Imagine being 30,000 feet in the air, trapped in a metal tube with nowhere to go, and your child is crying out of thirst. You press the call button, hoping for a simple glass of water, but what happens next is something you never could have prepared. 4. This is the story of a flight attendant who made a decision that would change her life forever, and the life of a little boy who just wanted a drink. It's a story about power, prejudice, and the consequences of our actions, all unfolding in the confined space of an airplane cabin. By the end of this tale, careers will be shattered, lives will be upended, and one question will linger in the air. Was justice served, or was it just the beginning of something much bigger? The flight began like any other. Passengers shuffled to their seats, stowing luggage and buckling up for the journey ahead. Among them was a young mother, Sarah, traveling with her 7-year-old son, Jordan. Jordan was a bright, curious child with a love for airplanes and an endless supply of questions. He had been excited for this trip for weeks, counting down the days until he could look out the window and see the world from above. But as the plane ascended, the excitement gave way to discomfort. The air inside the cabin felt dry, and Jordan's throat began to ache. "Mom, I'm thirsty," he whispered, tugging at her sleeve. Sarah smiled reassuringly and pressed the call button above their seats. She expected a quick response. After all, it was just water. But what happened next would leave her stunned. The flight attendant, a woman in her late 30s named Linda, approached with a polite but detached smile. Sarah explained that her son needed some water, but Linda's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Her eyes flicked toward Jordan, then back to Sarah. "I'm sorry," she said curtly, "but we're preparing for meal service. You'll have to wait." Sarah blinked, confused. "It's just water," she repeated, her voice firm but calm. "He's really thirsty." Linda's lips tightened. "I said you'll have to wait," she replied, her tone now edged with irritation. Before Sarah could respond, Linda turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Jordan to whimper softly in his seat. Sarah felt a knot of frustration tighten in her chest. This wasn't about water anymore. It was about respect. And something about the way Linda had looked at her son made her stomach churn. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah tried to shake off the encounter. Maybe Linda was just having a bad day. Maybe she was overwhelmed with her duties. But then Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. A few rows ahead, a white passenger had pressed their call button, and Linda was there in an instant, handing over a bottle of water with a warm smile. Sarah's heart sank. Was this really happening? Was her son being treated differently because of the color of his skin? She glanced down at Jordan, who was now resting his head against the window, his lips dry and cracked. She couldn't let this go. Not now. Not ever. What Sarah did next would set off a chain reaction that no one on that plane could have predicted. She stood up, her voice steady but loud enough to carry through the cabin. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Linda directly. "Why is it that you can give water to everyone else but not my son?" The cabin fell silent. Passengers turned in their seats, their eyes darting between Sarah and Linda. For a moment, Linda looked stunned, her face flushing with embarrassment, or was it anger? She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say a word, a voice crackled over the intercom. It was the captain, his tone calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been made aware of a situation on board, and we will be addressing it immediately. Please remain seated." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Sarah sat back down, her heart pounding. Jordan looked up at her, his eyes wide with confusion. "What's happening, Mom?" he asked. She squeezed his hand, forcing a smile. "It's going to be okay," she whispered. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. What would happen next? Would Linda apologize? Would the airline take action? Or would this moment be swept under the rug? Another story of injustice lost in the noise of everyday life? As the plane continued its journey, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. And she was right, because just 7 minutes later, Linda's life would change forever. But how? And why? The answers to those questions would come at a cost, one that no one on that plane could have anticipated. And as the story unfolds, one thing becomes clear. Sometimes, the smallest actions can have the biggest consequences. But was this a story of justice served, or was it just the beginning of something much darker? Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss. As the plane hummed steadily through the sky, the silence in the cabin felt heavier than ever. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering to their neighbors, while others pretended to focus on their books or screens, avoiding the tension. Altogether, Sarah kept her arm around Jordan, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the image of Linda's face, the way her expression had hardened when she looked at Jordan. It wasn't just about the water anymore. It was about something deeper, something uglier. And Sarah wasn't the only one who had noticed. A few rows back, a man named Marcus, a frequent flyer who had seen his fair share of airline drama, watched the scene unfold with growing unease. He had been on enough flights to know when something was off. The way Linda had dismissed Sarah and Jordan didn't sit right with him. He pulled out his phone and began typing a quick note, documenting what he had seen. He wasn't sure what he would do with it yet, but he knew one thing. If this went viral, the airline would have a major problem on their hands. And if it didn't, well, he'd make sure it did. Meanwhile, Linda stood near the galley, her hands trembling as she tried to busy herself with the meal preparations. She could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, and it made her skin crawl. She told herself she had done nothing wrong. The airline had protocols, and she was just following them. But deep down, a small voice nagged at her. Had she really been fair? Or had she let her own biases cloud her judgment? She shook her head, pushing the thought away. She couldn't afford to second-guess herself now. Not in front of everyone. Back in her seat, Sarah replayed the encounter in her mind. She thought about the times she had faced similar situations. Subtle slights, microaggressions, the kind of things people could easily dismiss if they weren't paying attention. But this felt different. This wasn't subtle. This was blatant. And it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Jordan, her sweet, innocent son, who had done nothing wrong but exist in a world that sometimes seemed determined to make him feel small. She clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let this go. Not this time. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again, pulling everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We are handling the situation and will provide an update shortly. His words were calm, but there was an edge to them that suggested this wasn't just a routine announcement. Sarah glanced at Jordan, who was now dozing off, his head resting against her shoulder. She kissed his forehead, her heart aching. She didn't want him to grow up in a world where he had to fight for basic respect. But if that's what it took, she would fight for him. In the cockpit, the captain, a seasoned pilot named Greg, was deep in conversation with the first officer. They had been alerted to the situation by a concerned passenger who had discreetly informed a crew member. Greg prided himself on running a tight ship, and he didn't tolerate unprofessional behavior from his crew. But this was more than just a disciplinary issue. This was a potential PR nightmare. He knew the power of social media, and he knew how quickly a story like this could spiral out of control. He had to act fast. Greg picked up the phone and called the airline's ground operations. He explained the situation in hushed tones, careful not to alarm the passengers further. The person on the other end listened intently, then assured him they would handle it. But Greg wasn't satisfied. He wanted answers, and he wanted them now. "Get me everything you have on Linda," he said. "I need to know if this is a pattern, or just a one-time thing." As the plane continued its journey, the tension in the cabin grew thicker. Passengers began to murmur among themselves, speculating about what would happen next. Some sided with Sarah, expressing outrage at Linda's behavior. Others defended Linda, suggesting that maybe there was more to the story. "She's probably just stressed," one woman whispered to her husband. "Flying is a tough job." But her husband shook his head. "That's no excuse," he replied. "You don't treat people like that, especially not a kid." Sarah overheard the conversation and felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she wasn't alone in this. Maybe others saw what she saw. She glanced at Marcus, who gave her a subtle nod of support. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to her. She wasn't just fighting for Jordan anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. Meanwhile, Linda's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She tried to focus on her duties, but her hands shook as she poured drinks and handed out meals. She could feel the judgment in the air, and it was suffocating. She wanted to explain herself, to tell everyone that she wasn't a bad person. But how could she? She wasn't even sure she believed it herself. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are stowed." His tone was calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension that no one could miss. Sarah tightened her grip on Jordan's hand, her heart pounding. She didn't know what would happen when they landed, but she knew one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When the plane touched down, the passengers erupted into a flurry of activity, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. But Sarah stayed seated, her eyes fixed on the front of the plane. She wasn't going anywhere. Until she got answers. Marcus lingered nearby, his phone in hand, ready to capture whatever happened next. Linda stood near the exit, her face pale as she forced a smile and thanked passengers for flying with the airline. But her eyes kept darting toward Sarah, and there was no mistaking the fear in them. As the last of the passengers filed out, Greg emerged from the cockpit and approached Sarah. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "we'd like to speak with you and your son privately. We take these matters very seriously, and we want to ensure that your concerns are addressed." Sarah nodded, her heart racing. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing. This was just the beginning. And as she followed Greg down the jet bridge, with Jordan's small hand in hers, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was yet to come. What would the airline do next? Would Linda face consequences for her actions? Or would this be swept under the rug? Another story lost in the noise? And what about Sarah and Jordan? Would they find justice? Or would they be left to fight this battle on their own? The answers to these questions were still up in the air, but one thing was certain. This was a story that would leave no one untouched. And as the wheels of justice began to turn, the world would be watching. But for now, the tension remained unresolved, hanging in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. As Sarah and Jordan followed Captain Greg down the jet bridge, the airport buzzed with its usual chaos. Travelers rushing to catch flights, families reuniting, and announcements blaring over the loudspeakers. But for Sarah, the world felt eerily quiet, as if everything had narrowed to this moment. She glanced down at Jordan, who was clutching her hand tightly, his wide eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Mom, are we in trouble?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. Sarah squeezed his hand reassuringly. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "We're just going to talk to some people. Everything's going to be okay." But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in her chest. They were led to a small, private office near the gate, where a woman in a crisp airline uniform introduced herself as Claire, the customer relations manager. Claire's demeanor was professional but warm, and she offered Sarah and Jordan seats before taking one herself. "First of all," Claire began, "I want to apologize for what happened on the flight. We take these matters very seriously, and we're committed to ensuring that every passenger is treated with respect and dignity." Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving Claire's face. She appreciated the apology, but she needed more than words. She needed action. As Claire began to explain the airline's process for handling complaints, Sarah's mind wandered back to the flight. She thought about the way Linda had looked at Jordan, the way her voice had hardened when she refused to give him water. It wasn't just about the water, it was about the message it sent. That Jordan didn't deserve the same courtesy as the other passengers. That he was somehow less than. Sarah's jaw tightened as she fought back the anger rising in her chest. She wouldn't let this go. Not for Jordan. Not for herself. Not for anyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. Meanwhile, Linda was in another part of the airport, sitting in a stark, windowless room with a union representative and a member of the airline's HR team. Her hands were clasped tightly. In her lap, her knuckles white. She had been flying for over a decade, and in all that time, she had never been called into a meeting like this. The HR representative, a stern-looking man named Robert slid a folder across the table. "Linda," he said, his tone neutral but firm, "we've received a complaint about your conduct on the flight. Can you tell us what happened?" Linda took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had rehearsed this moment in her head a dozen times since the plane landed, but now that she was here, the words felt stuck in her throat. "I was just doing my job," she said finally, her voice trembling. "We were preparing for meal service, and I told the passenger she would have to wait. I didn't think it was a big deal." Robert raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "And what about the other passenger who requested water? The one you served immediately?" Linda's face flushed. "That was different," she said quickly. "They were in first class. We're supposed to prioritize them." Robert exchanged a glance with the union representative, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Linda," Robert said slowly, "this isn't just about the water. It's about how you handled the situation. The way you spoke to the passenger, the way you treated her son. It's all on camera, and it doesn't look good." Linda's heart sank. She had forgotten about the cameras. Of course they had caught everything. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came out. What could she say? That she hadn't meant to be rude? That she hadn't realized how her actions would be perceived? It all sounded hollow, even to her. Back in the office, Sarah was growing impatient. Claire had been talking for what felt like forever, but she still hadn't answered the most important question. What was the airline going to do about Linda? "I appreciate everything you've said," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm but polite. "But what I really want to know is how you're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. My son was humiliated, and I won't let that go unaddressed." Claire nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I understand," she said, "and I want you to know that we're taking this very seriously. Linda has been suspended pending an investigation, and we'll be reviewing our training protocols too. Ensure that all of our staff are held to the highest standards." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Suspended? That was a start, but it wasn't enough. She wanted Linda to understand the impact of her actions. She wanted her to feel the same hurt and frustration that Jordan had felt. But more than that, she wanted to make sure no other child ever had to go through what Jordan did. "What about the other passengers?" she asked. "The ones who saw what happened? They deserve to know that this isn't being swept under the rug." Claire hesitated, her professional mask slipping for just a moment. "We're handling this internally," she said carefully, "but we'll be issuing a statement to address the situation." Sarah wasn't satisfied, but she knew she wasn't going to get any more answers today. She stood up, pulling Jordan to his feet. "Thank you for your time," she said, her tone polite but firm. "But this isn't over. Not for me, and not for my son." Claire nodded, her expression unreadable. "I understand," she said, "and we'll be in touch as soon as we have more information." Sarah gave her a curt nod before leading Jordan out of the office and into the bustling airport. As they walked toward baggage claim, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a notification from Marcus, the passenger who had witnessed the incident. "Hey," the message read, "I recorded what happened on the plane. Let me know if you need it." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This could change everything. She quickly typed a reply, her fingers trembling. "Thank you. I'll be in touch." Meanwhile, Linda was leaving the airport, her head down and her shoulders slumped. She had been told to go home and wait for further instructions, but she knew what that meant. Her career was hanging by a thread, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she felt a wave of despair wash over her. How had it come to this? She had always prided herself on being a good flight attendant, someone who went above and beyond for her passengers. But now, all she could think about was the look on Jordan's face when she had refused him water. The hurt in his eyes. The way his mother had stood up for him, unflinching and unwavering. Linda got into her car and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel without seeing it. She thought about her life, about the choices she had made and the person she had become. Had she always been this way? Or had something changed along the way, something she hadn't even noticed until it was too late? She didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about losing her job. This was about losing herself. As Sarah and Jordan waited for their luggage, Sarah's mind was racing. She knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She had Marcus's recording, and she had a story that needed to be told. But she also knew that going public would come with risks. Would people believe her? Or would they dismiss her as just another angry passenger looking for attention? And what about Jordan? Was she ready to put him in the spotlight, to make him the face of this fight? The baggage carousel whirred to life, and Sarah spotted their suitcase. She grabbed it and hoisted it onto the cart, her movements automatic. As her mind continued to churn, she didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to back down. Not for Jordan. Not for herself. Not for anyone who had ever been made to feel small. This was just the beginning, and the storm was far from over. Stay tuned, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming.